death. He wouldn't be on board the McAfee anymore, the only place he'd ever thought of as home. But that was exactly why he had to save it. The gnome rotated the ship's wheel 3 turns to the right, managing to remain steady as the crew was thrown back and forth across the deck. He whipped the wheel the opposite way, 2 turns, as the mainmast creaked, a dangerous sound that hinted of last moments. Finally, Quiet stepped backward and bowed his head in a final goodbye, rain splattering his face and covering the tears flowing down his cheeks. The McAfee flickered. Quiet worried the spell hadn't worked. He glanced at his feet that remained on the moving deck. When his ship disappeared around him, he smiled, knowing his spell had worked. He had transported his ship, its crew, and those they had rescued to calm, safe waters where they could sail on to a better place. Briefly suspended in midair, Quiet said a simple goodbye to the earth he'd loved all his life and would no longer see again. Then he plunged into the unforgiving waters of the North Sea to be swept up in the great storm. He could save an entire ship and its people, but ironically, not himself. Not if he was going to funnel all his power into ensuring the spell worked. And there was no reason to do anything unless it was done right. The exhaustion hit him as soon as he plunged into the freezing cold sea. Waves buried him and carried the gnome away. Chapter 3. The afterlife tasted like sand. To Quiet's surprise, his body still hurt after death. He thought he'd feel weightless, free, finally at peace. But instead, everything in his body screamed for his attention, especially his lungs. He rolled over onto his back, and that's when the eruption began. Coughs rocketed from the little gnome's body and made him think he'd choke on his lungs. The idea he still had lungs after drowning in the North Sea was especially perplexing. Quiet continued to cough, a seemingly unending sound that was especially loud in his ears, even though they were clogged with water. Rolling over once more, Quiet got to his hands and knees and spat out what felt like a gallon of water. It filled his mouth and triggered his gag reflex. Dying was horrible. He hoped it would be over soon, but something told him it might not. It might have been his gasping for air, even as his chest burned and his face felt hot. He shook his head, and wet hair spattered across his eyes. All Quiet wanted was for this death thing to be over. It appeared death, like everything in life, was a process. He crawled across the sandy beach, which he fully believed was a part of his hallucination. He was sinking to the bottom of the North Sea. That was what was happening. The granules of sand under his fingers was the strangest sensation. The cold wind whipping across his water-soaked body was surreal, and the heaviness of the emotion that he'd never see the world he loved again was the worst heartache he'd ever known. It all had to be an illusion, he thought to himself. The thought sent him back on his tailbone to sit and look at the choppy sea, feeling as though surrender was a fake breath away. The gnome rocked back and forth, his hands in his lap as he shivered violently. He wasn't sure why he saw white caps and a gray sky and a storm in the distance when Quiet knew he was drowning. It was just how death was, he guessed. He had never done it before, so it made sense it would feel all strange and disorienting. Death, like life, had to be a bit like trickery. One moment you think you're going to win, and then it all crashed down. Just like Quiet had thought they'd get away scot-free with the refugees, or like so many times in life when things felt comfortable and then became the hardest thing in the world. The captain of the McAfee sat staring at the ocean, wondering when clouds and sky and angels would welcome him to the afterlife. It didn't come. When hunger and thirst set in after a long hour, something he hadn't expected appeared. "Hello, dear," a woman's voice sang beside Quiet. He turned his head and found a creature who looked more like a tree than a person. Her skin was brown and flaky like bark. Her hair flowed like vines, and her eyes were the color of the bluest sky. They blinked at him in a way that made Quiet feel unconditionally